So thanks for coming out. I really am glad that so many of you are here. I'm going to tell you a bit about the book just very casually, and then I thought it would be more interesting if I just showed you some clips from some films and we just sort of talk through it like that, because I know some of you might not be familiar with this work. I expect that, and it would be great if you saw examples of it and then we sort of talked about it. Hopefully we'll have some time for questions or just conversation at the end. Tell me if I'm getting too boring or just, you know, going on too much. Just give me like terrible grimaces and I'll try and figure it out. So my book is called Flesh Cinema, The Corporeal Turn in American Avant-Garde Film. And it looks at sexually explicit, mostly sexually explicit films from the 1960s and 70s by a handful of American artists who worked in film, but not always primarily in film, often in other media like Yoko Ono or Andy Warhol. And one of the things that I sort of argue in the book is that American avant-garde film of this period takes a turn toward the body and really begins to investigate not only the representations of bodies in sort of explicit sexual scenarios, but that it also addresses the spectator in a much more corporeal fashion, that it really addresses the spectator in a physiological way. And one of the things that I'm interested in the book is how, I mean, the films that are associated with this movement that I'm trying to sort of organize were the most provocative and daring forms of American visual culture in this period. And they really helped to break decades of film censorship in the United States, that the images were so explicit and so provocative that they started really changing what American viewers saw on screen in those periods. So one of the things that I'm interested in is how, even though these films became kind of notorious for having explicit pornographic images of sex and the body, that they are in many ways very difficult to watch for a whole variety of reasons, and their difficulty is what is, you know, really interesting about them as works of art, that they don't claim to represent the body transparently, to sort of give the viewer unmediated access to the body, but they make watching films a corporeal exercise that sometimes is quite difficult, that is often sexually titillating, that is sometimes a kind of feat of endurance. And I'm going to show you different examples of that difficulty and that lack of transparency. So rather than sort of spelling out more about the book, I think we should just begin with some examples so that you can, you know, more quickly see what I'm talking about. So I'm going to start with a screen test of a poet named Anne Buchanan that Andy Warhol filmed in 1964. And I wanted to give you a little bit of background on the screen tests. Warhol began making films in 1963, and he retired from filmmaking in 1968 after he was shot and almost killed by a woman named Valerie Solanas. And so he only made films for 5 years, but during that period, he basically recreated the entire history of cinema, that he went back to what was, you know, kind of known as the primitive period, black and white silent films where the camera doesn't move, there's no credits, they're unedited, and he gradually began to add things like color and sound and editing and camera movement and dialogue and some forms of narrative. And by the time he retired in 1968, he had kind of gone from these early silent films with no movement to these almost feature-length films that sometimes even showed in commercial theaters like Chelsea Girls or something like that. So the screen tests were part of, they're a really large catalog of films that he started making in 1963, right when he began making films, supposedly because it was easier than painting, which as a painter I would agree. And he made films, the screen test, between 1963 and 1965. He made almost 500 of them. And they are each between 3 and 4 minutes long. They are the length of one reel of film. And when the reel ran out, the screen test was over. But he shot the film at silent speed. And so the reel of film is, 100 meters. It's actually 3 minutes long, but then when they're projected, they take a bit longer because they're now being projected at a different speed, so they're closer to 4 minutes. Now, there's a lot of rumors about how Warhol produced these films, and certainly there are so many of them that there probably were different, there are 500 of them, so obviously different circumstances define the different screen tests. But what we know about it is that Warhol would tell people not to move, that he was really interested in creating a form of portraiture in a moving image medium that was nevertheless about stillness. And he was really interested in how stillness emerged over time in durational media and what happened to the stillness of the body, not in a still photograph, which captured just an instant, but as the body was sort of pressured to remain still over the course of the filming time. And so he would tell his subjects, don't move. And people responded to it in different ways. The screen tests are a kind of who's who catalog of American art at that moment, and they feature poets and musicians and actors and artists and dancers. Sort of everybody in the New York art world appears in the screen tests, and different artists that Warhol photographed interpreted this dictum in different ways. Some people absolutely defied it and would sort of like spin around or, like really perform for the camera, and some people tried to obey it. My favorite of the screen tests is this one of Anne Buchanan, because she tries to remain perfectly still for the entire 3 minutes, including not blinking. And so it's really fascinating to watch what happens to her face as she endures this feat. It's my contention that Warhol's most significant contribution to portraiture was made not in the silkscreens, but in these movies, because they're using a filmic medium in a different way. If we think about the traditional aims of portraiture, there's, first to capture the status of the sitter and to show how wealthy or successful that sitter was. And then as portraiture moved into the late 19th and 20th century, there was an emphasis on psychology to sort of capture some kind of interior subjective essence of the person whose portrait is being made. And we could see that, for example, in the portraits that Picasso makes, in the first half of the 20th century. Warhol was interested in both of those things. He was interested in celebrity and status and also psychology. But in the screen tests, he becomes particularly interested in the body and their portraits in a kind of physiological sense. Now, it's my contention that this image of Anne Buchanan that you're going to watch is nearly a pornographic portrait, even though we only see her face for the duration of the 4 minutes that it lasts. So I'm going to play it, and then we could talk about it a little bit. I'm just going to be switching between formats, so bear with me. So, this is a great setup because I really like to watch people watch that movie and sort of observe what you're doing. So one of the things that I noticed that a lot of people were doing was they were sort of staring very wide-eyed at the film and almost kind of mimicking the non-blinking concentration that Anne Buchanan has during the screen test. There is a Hungarian film theorist by the name of Béla Balázs, and he's one of the most famous sort of classical film theorists, and he writes one of the sort of most important accounts of film theory in the first half of the 20th century. And one of the things that Balázs is really famous for is theorizing the close-up. And what Balázs argues about the close-up, he says that it's unique to cinema, that the close-up is part of what makes cinema cinematic. It can't be offered in other media, the kind of immensity of the close-up. This is a great screen to demonstrate that the magnitude of the close-up. And he says the close-up allows us hidden access to the life of everyday things. And he believes that the kind of minute changes in a person's facial physiognomy will reveal, can you guys hear me? Yeah, will reveal the kind of inner, what's happening? I know it's happening. Right, you pause. Okay. Will kind of reveal the secret life of the person, and even as an actor is trying to compose a face like a smile, that if we look at the involuntary actions that are happening, we could see the true emotions of that person. And so Balázs claims the close-up is a gateway to the inner truth of the subject. What is so interesting about Balázs's language is that he's talking about psychology and he's claiming that the close-up gives us the truth about the person, but his language is all very physiological. And so he starts talking about involuntary sort of throbs and spasms of facial muscles. And it's interesting that he's using this very bodily, physical vocabulary to talk about something spiritual or something psychological. I think that in Anne Buchanan's screen test, we get a kind of sense of what Balázs meant by the involuntary throbs giving us access to the subject. And yet we don't learn very much about Anne Buchanan's character or her psychology in this screen test, but we learn a lot about the physiology of the body. That after a certain amount of time, when you try not to blink your eyes, that the tears just start coming. And that really accounts for the drama in the scene, like when she swallows and we see her throat throb and the tears just start welling up in her eyes and then pouring down. I would argue that this is almost a pornographic kind of portrait in the sense that it's privileging the involuntary motions of the face and the throat and the neck as the kind of unmediated truth of the person. Now that might sound like a stretch, but if we could compare Anne Buchanan's tears to the kind of ejaculatory fluid that we see in pornography, there's something very important in common there, which is that it's so funny talking to an audience you've never met before about these things, but so ejaculation in pornography, that is the signal that pleasure is really being had, that pleasure is authentic. So all of the kind of hysterics of the porn performers trying to convince you they're having such a good time that don't seem that credible pale in comparison to this involuntary reflux that produces a kind of authentic truth of the subject. And I would say that something similar is happening in Anne Buchanan's screen test, where the tears are kind of producing evidence that yes, indeed, she kept her eyes open for this long, that they're a kind of bodily proof that is offered up to the viewer. And we respond very powerfully to images like that. And so I was sort of describing how you all look to me. One of the things that pornography asks us to do is to mimic the responses of the performers on screen. So pornography is good if, when the performers are having an orgasm, the viewers are also having an orgasm, right? And so, like in a horror film, when the protagonist is afraid and they scream, like we scream too, and it's a good horror film. And so pornography makes that kind of imitative address to the audience, where it wants us to behave as the performers behave on screen in this out-of-control physical response. I would say in a very subtle way, something similar is happening when you guys are sort of staring and trying not to blink in your own way, watching the Anne Buchanan, that we are mirroring the representations on screen in this new physiological way. So this, the next clip that I'm going to show you is from Warhol's film Blowjob, which he makes in 1964, so the same year as Anne Buchanan's screen test. It's not a screen test, it's about 40 minutes long, but it's part of his interest in portraiture. And the title of the film is obviously very provocative, and so audiences, would go to see it because they thought they were going to see explicit images of sexuality, which Warhol sometimes gave them in other films, but in Blowjob he denies. The film has been called the most conceptual piece of pornography ever made, because all that we see for the duration of its 40 minutes is a close-up of this man's face, who was unknown at the time, as he presumably receives a blowjob below the frame. But since the camera never moves, and there's no sound, we really never know if anything at all is happening below the frame, and if indeed we believe that a blowjob may be occurring, any information about that sex act is completely withheld. Is a man giving it? Is a woman giving it? Is it really happening? Are there other people there? So we don't know anything about that, but Warhol, just through the title of the film, is sort of asking us to conceive of this man's face as pornographic evidence. So this is this moment where the image of the genitals is withheld and the image of the face is given as a kind of exchange. And I would say that this bears great relation to the screen test of Anne Buchanan, but in a way it's even less pornographic, because without those involuntary tears, we have no idea if this is just a performance or a put-on. So I wanted to show you just a couple minutes of Warhol's Blowjob. This is a film, Blue Movie, that he makes in 1968. It's his last film, and it actually achieves, has explicit representations of heterosexual sex in it, which Blowjob does not. Okay, so where is that? Sorry to show it on YouTube, it's just I'm working with so many different platforms, I thought it would be easier to not show them all on DVD. Forgive me. Okay, we could have lights off again. So that you just saw a tiny little bit of the film, and when we see the white, it's just the reel has ended and Warhol loads another reel in the camera and begins filming again. Now what's interesting about this is that the moment that I've chosen where he smokes a cigarette, by the time he smokes a cigarette, you wonder whether you've missed something, right? Like, has the performer had an orgasm, and if so, how come we didn't know it? And then for someone like me who's seen the film many times, you rewatch it and you start looking for these moments of bodily revelation, these moments that are going to give it away, like the orgasm might be happening now. Is it when he raises his hand into the frame and sort of wipes his lips? Do those winces, are those winces of pleasure? Is he bored? Is he frustrated? Is anything at all happening? So we start to pay attention to the face in new ways. And I would argue that that rapt attention that these films make us pay to the face is part of their pornographic mode of address, even as they withhold explicit images of sexuality. Audiences, blowjob has always been talked about as this exercise in the torture of the audience because of what it withholds. And when the film was screened at Columbia University in the 1960s in New York, supposedly, audiences were chanting, they were really frustrated, and they were chanting, "We shall never come." That Warhol was just simply torturing people by getting them into the theaters with these kind of titles and then not delivering the goods. And he got a reputation for being a kind of cock teaser, and Blowjob is the classic film of Warhol's cock teasing phase. But I think it's interesting, rather than only focusing on what the film withholds, right? It withholds any knowledge of whether a sex act is really taking place. I think it's interesting to think of what the film actually gives us, and this is sort of getting us into what I'm calling flesh cinema. That this film does not show explicit imagery. We're going to see films that do, but the mode of address is quite key to the period of films that I'm theorizing, in the sense that even what it gives you, right? It doesn't give you the sex acts or any proof that it's actually occurred. It gives us some belated, mysterious sign that perhaps something has occurred with the cigarette, but what it actually gives us is the face. It gives us 40 minutes to scrutinize this face. And yet, even as it delivers the face is being withheld. So if you notice the difference in the lighting between this film and Anne Buchanan's screen test, she's lit very frontally, where he has an overhead light source that is casting his face in deep shadow. So even the face the film is offering is being withheld by the shadows. And so there's many layers of kind of revelation and withholding that are happening in Warhol's cinema, and I would say that's a key feature of Warhol's cinema, that even when he starts giving us more explicit sexual images in works beginning around, later in 64, but more regularly in 66, 67, 68, that he's always playing this sort of game of hide and seek with us that is part of his conceptual exploration of sexuality. We're going to sort of move on now. We're sort of sticking around the same year, but I wanted to show you an example of very different kind of work from the same period, which is, I'm going to show you a clip from Flaming Creatures, which is probably the most notorious American experimental or avant-garde film from this period, and it was directed by a man named Jack Smith, who some of you may have heard of. Jack Smith was a pioneer of American performance art, even though it wasn't really called that at the time. But he would kind of improvise these theatrical performances on the streets of, downtown New York City in the late 50s with his friend Ken Jacobs, who often shot a lot of the footage. And then used it in his films. And so here's Jack Smith sort of performing in 1957 just on the street. And this has been theorized in the United States, at least, as being a real precursor to the performance art that emerges later in the 1960s. Jack Smith was extremely influenced by popular culture, and he built his loft in downtown Manhattan was one of the first spaces where American performance art was being shown. He built a lagoon in his loft. And he would invite people over to come see performances, and he would make all the costumes himself and, experiment a lot with makeup. But most of the performance would consist of Jack Smith kind of inhabiting these radical personas, but people never knew if the performance had started or not, because he would sort of walk around this mess of his apartment and be moving objects as if he was just getting it right, and that would go on for hours and hours and hours, and people wouldn't know, is that the performance, are we still waiting? He's most famous, however, for this film that he makes in 1963 called Flaming Creatures, and it was shot on the sun-drenched rooftop of an abandoned movie theater in downtown New York with a bunch of Smith's friends, many of whom were drag queens, and the film does not have a conventional narrative at all. It's sort of, the performers in it are high on amphetamines, and Jack Smith is giving them very loose direction, but it is intended as a kind of homage to 1930s Hollywood B films, and it has this sort of Orientalist music and these ridiculous costumes that you're going to see. Jack Smith idolized this Hollywood B actress named Maria Montez, who was considered, such a terrible actress that she was kind of derided by the film critics all of the time. But Jack Smith, she was of Dominican origin, and Jack Smith saw in her the kind of perfect movie star, and he described her charms as being moldy, that like something that kind of festered. Jack Smith loved when things went wrong. That was what attracted to him about these low-budget Hollywood films. He loved the moment when, for example, the painted backdrop of the Taj Mahal would, mistakenly blow in the wind, and the illusion would be shattered. So he was always sort of cultivating these messy moments of lived experience in his own work. On the right side of the screen, you see Jack Smith kind of molding one of his own performers, a drag queen that he christened Mario Montez, who was a kind of imitation of Maria Montez in the 1960s and starred in a lot of Jack Smith's and also Warhol's films. I'm going to show you a little clip from Flaming Creatures. As I said, there's no real narrative. Descriptions of the film talk about a bunch of drag queens sort of cavorting on this rooftop, and then descriptions always talk about it. Then there's an earthquake, and all the drag queens die, and a few minutes later they're resurrected. But no matter how many times I've watched this film, there's no earthquake. What passes for an earthquake is this Moroccan chandelier sort of swinging back and forth, and the performers throw more garbage around the set. And I suppose that's what stands in for the earthquake, and then they all fall to the ground, and a few minutes later they climb out of their coffins and sort of start dancing around again. This clip that I'm going to show you is explicit, but it is I want you to pay attention to the way that Jack Smith is parroting kind of heteronormative assumptions about sexuality and patriarchy, and you'll see what I mean. So it's an image from Flaming Creatures, and let's go to the clip of it. This is what was accidentally playing before. Just going to rewind it a bit. Get a little sense of it. And they sort of, in the middle of the film, break into this kind of parody of a commercial advertisement for lipstick. And that's what I'm going to show you.
Fabulous new heart-shaped lipstick. It shapes your lips as it colors them. Toss out your lipstick brush. Wave goodbye to your lip line. Now created a lipstick that shapes the perfect outline every time. It's the new heart-shaped lipstick. No more blurring, no feathery edges, because this lipstick is pointed and curved like a heart. It draws a flawless line. It's into corners as no rounded lipstick can. You can even alter the shape of your lips in 5 new romantic shades. Pink, that is the heart of pink. Red, that is the soul of red. True coral, pure peach, luscious cherry. Our own dew-kiss formula that smooths your lips to the vibrant, soft, nude beauty. Heart-shaped lipstick in jeweler's designed metal case. Also, made in Paris, Juliet lipstick and lip liner. A lipstick creamy, moisturizing, indelible. Smoke, drink, kiss, without leaving a trace.
Is there a lipstick that doesn't come off when you suck the hearts?
Yes, indelible lipstick. Stays on and on.
But how does a man get lipstick off his cock?
A man is not supposed to have lipstick on his cock. It's supposed to be indelible, and therefore supposed to remain on her lips. Gain youthful allure and loveliness through new, lighter, continental colors, 22 shades altogether. Also a lip lining pencil for those who prefer to have a liner. Generous sample of enchanting French eyeshadow made by Antiquaire. Color harmony chalk. Sensational in new French technique. Outline your lips with a Goulet pencil created with an exciting mouth, alluring lips, and keep lipstick edges vibrant, fade-proof, as easy as writing your name. 4 shades to blend with Goulet lipstick. Excitingly new, exclusively yours. Are you the woman of a man? And women watch to see what's new. I just laid a cherry bomb.
Okay, so you're sort of getting a sense. I mean, there's a lot of different filmmaking styles associated with what I'm calling flash cinema, but you're already getting a kind of sense of what I'm after. That in the Warhol films, we see that the interest in sexuality can be indistinct from other kinds of bodily reactions like boredom or frustration or pain. Sometimes it's more erotic or more compelling to look at non-genital body parts in these films. And finally, in Flaming Creatures, when we see genitals, they are often so stripped of their functionality that they cease to register as the kind of erotic sexual attractions that we would expect in a culture that was as historically sex-starved as American audiences were in the 1960s. In spite of the fact that this film completely deconstructs gender identity and sexuality, it was nonetheless a kind of scandal of 1963 in the United States. The film was censored, and there was a court trial about it that sent all of these public intellectuals like Allen Ginsberg and Susan Sontag rushing to the film's defense, even though audiences sort of found the film very unwatchable. And in the trial that ensued, the projectionist was arrested, the theater manager was arrested. This was one of many stories in American film of this period, but it became the most famous one. And Flaming Creatures became this film that was championed as sort of breaking down American censorship laws. It's very interesting to actually watch the film because it's not what you would expect when you read about that censorship history, because even though it's showing these very taboo images of the male genitals, for example, it's not showing them in any customary way. That it is as, when a penis is sort of hanging limply over someone's shoulder as they're applying lipstick and talking about the benefits of this lipstick or that. They are really deconstructing the relationship between the penis, for example, and male phallocentric power. That these films are completely undermining the association of masculinity and mastery and are making the distinction between the sexes very ambiguous. So that when we see the kind of tableau of all of these flaming creatures arranged together in their costumes and their makeup, it becomes increasingly unclear who is even biologically male or biologically female. And so to the sort of list of characteristics about flesh cinema that we're getting, I would like to add this obscuring of gender and anatomical distinction as one of the central focuses of films associated with this movement. And filmmakers do that in all different ways. Coming back to the images over here, sorry, I keep having to go through it. So the next artist that I want to talk about is Yoko Ono, and obviously I know you guys have a great familiarity with her work here in Iceland. Yoko Ono, as you know, started off as a musician first and then a visual artist, and she came to filmmaking in the mid-60s, and she was part of Fluxus, which was an international movement of artists, and she was invited by another artist associated with Fluxus to come over to his apartment and experiment with a camera. And the camera was a scientific camera with a very good close-up lens, but was not very portable. It was sort of an interesting contraption. And so Peter Moore, who had the camera, he advised the other artists that they should film very simple motion. And they should sort of concentrate on simple motion because the camera wasn't going to be very good at capturing more elaborate scenes. And so Yoko Ono made several films that first day, which were known as Flux films. They were like 4-minute films. And then she expanded the one that was called Number 4 into a larger 80-minute long film called Bottoms, which was hundreds of participants being filmed on this little device that you see where they're sort of walking in place as if on a treadmill, and the camera is set up to capture their asses as they're walking, but they never actually walk out of frame because they're sort of walking in place. And in the longer version of the film, which you're going to see an image of from 1966, it's a sound film. The original was silent, and we hear the soundtrack is composed of ambient sound that was recorded when all of these subjects were making the film. And so you hear them sort of talking as filming was happened, and you also, a lot of press gathered. It was a kind of art world celebrity event, and a lot of press gathered and were interviewing the subjects. And the soundtrack is played mismatched or asynchronous with the images that we see, so that the voices we hear don't actually belong to the buttocks that we're watching. One of the interesting things, so to compare it to Warhol's screen tests, that was almost 500, different art world celebrities, and they were showing their faces, which was, of course, their most recognizable feature. Although because the screen tests were silent and Warhol asked his subjects not to move, they were not allowed to show off the talents for which they were famous for. In Bottoms, it's another kind of screen test, in the sense that Yoko Ono doesn't invite just anybody to be in the film, but she invites all of these really famous, important artists of the period. And so the film Bottoms is a kind of celebrity screen test of people signed with their anuses. That's the way she described it. And she was sort of mocking that kind of celebrity culture at the same time that she was upholding it. In my book, I compare, films like Bottoms and the screen test to Muybridge's motion studies, which were proto-cinematic, photographic experiments done in the late 19th century, beginning in the 1870s, that were capturing basic human locomotion. And I think about Bottoms in relationship to these early silent motion studies because of their focus on how a body looks while it's moving and sort of distilling narrative down to just this essential feature of movement. One of the things that's interesting, however, and I deliberately chose this image of Muybridge, although I could have chosen dozens of others, is that Muybridge, he's sort of claiming to represent the human species as it moves, and he also films other animals like horses and dogs, and he's just really interested in the sort of how a body looks when it's moving. And yet the photographs, they were published in a scientific journal, but they were always interested in sexuality. I mean, because in the late 19th century, you don't have nude photos of models in a scientific journal without kind of eliciting a more erotic response. One of the interesting things about Muybridge's photos is that they really make these hard distinctions between the genders. And so in this one, woman turning around in surprise and running away, we see a woman kind of enacting these gestures associated with shame that none of the male participants in Muybridge's studies of human and animal locomotion, there's no equivalent. That these are these sort of stereotypically female gestures, theatrical gestures that are being recorded as if they're just natural movement when the men are asked to do more neutral things. And so there are these gender distinctions that are already being implanted in this supposedly neutral scientific study. This is exactly the kind of thing that Yoko Ono avoids by choosing this more gender-neutral part of the body and choosing to film it as she does. So I want to show you that. It's an image from it, but I think I have to put it in. Put in the DVD when I took the last one out.
There's nothing wrong with exposing your behind. I went in, and when I got up on the stage, well, I was conscious at first, and then gradually I just kept concentrated on walking at an even pace and forgot, I had no pants on.
How old are you, Miss Prendergast?
23.
I assume that you're single.
Single.
You've just taken part in this film. Would you tell us what you had to do?
Stand on a platform that runs on ball bearings so that you can walk forward while staying in the same place. It's very tricky. The thing runs away with you.
I see. And what did you do? What did you do? I beg your pardon. What did you do then?
Nothing. You just, when you've got the sort of hang of it, so you don't stagger and lurch and weave from side to side, then he films for a few moments, and that's it.
He is filming, actually filming your backside.
Yes.
I see. You don't remove your clothes, I assume.
Well, yes, either you remove them or hang them around your neck. I found it easier to remove them.
Oh, you remove them? I see, entirely, is it?
Well, I left my bra and that didn't show, but my dress was thick. I didn't want to wear it around my neck.
I see. You have no feelings about exposing your body in the sense?
No, I have mind much less when I did remove my clothes than I would have minded if I'd sort of hitched my dress up, you know.
I see.
When I first read it, I thought, no, thank you. And then I thought, no, I can't very well turn around and walk out the door, you know. But in fact, there's nothing, nothing embarrassing about it really at all. It was rather fun when I got used to that horrible platform.
You see what I mean? Yeah. But if you lean forward, it'll speed up, and then it actually is a little bit dangerous. You just keep walking while I set my shot up. Okay, good. How's that?
It's nothing to do with being an actor. Nothing to do with being an actor, because a garbage man could do it as well, a potato picker could do it as well, and a striptease dancer could probably do it much better.
Oh, yes, but they want some. They don't just want actors. They want people from all walks of life, sure.
How is an actor's ass different from anyone else's ass?
It isn't. They've got other sorts of people doing it as well.
That's right, so you don't have to be an actor.
Just imagining that sort of thing. And singing, too, was very nice to sort of sing with the movement of the thing going around, to make a sound that goes round and round, too. I don't think it needs explaining, no. I mean, I understand, I think, even if only partly, and even if only in my own way, but it makes perfect sense to me. You know, I'm fine.
You think you got it now? Yeah. Okay, then can you just stop for a minute, and now tuck your shirt up around your waist so that it won't fall down while we're making a shot. Better do it around the front, too. Maybe tie it in the front or something.
Well, I only found out that they were going to be filming your buttocks, you know, and that your buttocks don't change its expression, which is unlike your face, you see. It sort of changes expression according to mood and desire, where your buttocks just sort of stays one way.
But being in the older generation...
I might be the older generation, it doesn't mean I'm old degenerate. If you take over one of the little clubs I know in Berwick Street, you'll make a fortune showing this film, I can tell you. But you have an all-male clientele.
You know, that's where you want to focus, and that's where you want to...
Okay. So, like Warhol, Yoko Ono was mocking the censorship culture that she was making these films in, and because there was nudity, it was automatically sort of classified as a film that wasn't legal to show on American screens. But of course, it's an entirely innocent film in spite of the fact that it has nude images of both men and women. I'm sort of, in the beginning, I'm trying to sort of craft this analogy between films like Bottoms and The Screen Test as these different forms of bodily portraits that are being made in this period of American avant-garde cinema. As Ono said, these were celebrity portraits that had been signed with anuses, but one of the things that becomes interesting, both in the image track and the soundtrack, is that there's all this emphasis on the particularity of each ass, right? That as we're looking at each bottom, we can't help but notice the distinctions. You know, some are hairy, and some are hairless, some are firm, some are saggy, some we think might be male, some might be female. We notice racial differences, differences in skin tone, etc. And so one of the things that's happening on the soundtrack, I always know that when when I hear soundtracks in another language, I find it difficult to understand, and the sound quality is deliberately really poor in these, so if you're struggling, I'm sorry about that. But one of the things that they talk about is that each ass has its own expression. Like, they start talking about them as if they're like faces, and you could really tell the different mood of the participant by looking at the expression on their ass. And so Ono, like Warhol, is sort of thinking about what constitutes identity, what constitutes portraiture, that might we just be these sort of bodies that have their own expressions and personalities. Of course, she's also mocking it because she invites all these famous people to appear in it. And yet, there's a moment in the soundtrack when they say, well, you could be a potato picker. Why do you need an actor to be in this movie? You know, like, can an actor do this any better than a potato picker? No, but it's important to have an actor in it. And so it's really questioning these notions of performance, that in focusing on everyday bodily motion, which you could link to a lot of the dance experiments at Judson Church at that time, there's this kind of new attention paid to ordinary movement, that ordinary movement might be more profound and more compelling to watch than these sort of scripted theatrics of narrative cinema, of Hollywood cinema, which was sort of declining at that period. Again, like Jack Smith, Yoko Ono really undermines the anatomical distinction between the sexes, so that sometimes it's obvious what gender, the body is that we're watching, but very often it's not as the film goes on. And she's also undermining sort of standards of beauty. So there's a moment later in the film where we see a butt that has like a particularly large growth on it, and the soundtrack is talking about how buttocks are all so beautiful. And so the film, in many ways, it's related to Warhol in the sense that it's a catalog. It's a body catalog, like the screen tests. It's a catalog of portraits of famous artists. And yet the tone is very different, in that Warhol entombs his subjects in this kind of deathly silence, where it's almost a kind of feat of endurance for his subjects to remain in front of the camera, that there's a kind of disciplining of the subject or torture of the subject. It's not easy to not move and compose yourself in front of the camera, and we see signs of Anne Buchanan's duress in her performance. Yoko Ono's catalog of portraits is very different in the sense that its ethos is more about inclusion and participation and kind of erasing the social distinctions that guide us so much in regular life. We're going to sort of switch tones here a bit, and I wanted to show you, I remember now to do this one, get it ready. I wanted to sort of shift focus to Stan Brakhage, who many of you have probably, I think if I do this, maybe it won't be so bad. Okay, finally figured that out. See if it works though. Sorry. So shifting our focus to Stan Brakhage. Stan Brakhage is considered the kind of most important American avant-garde filmmaker who ever lived, and he worked for many decades, beginning in the 1950s until his death in the 2000s. And he reinvented film language and what was possible to do with film by focusing on different aspects of the filmmaking process. Now, Stan Brakhage he made thousands of films. They are handmade. He moved with his family to the woods of Colorado and sort of focused on the rituals of birth, death, lovemaking, man's relationship to nature, man's relationship to God, and in many ways he was working against the kind of pop traditions of someone like Andy Warhol, and this return to these romantic notions of the individual and the self, sort of struggling through the cycles of life. Brakhage was really interested in vision, and so nearly all of his films are silent, because he was so fascinated by vision that he didn't want to sort of complicate things with sound. And one of the things that Brakhage was committed to was trying to use the camera in different ways so as to recapture what he described as untutored vision, that he was really interested in how an infant might see the world before the acquisition of language and culture, before things are named. And so he used the camera in ways to try and stimulate, re-stimulate the fullness of perception that he felt had been so narrowly disciplined by how we are taught to see. And so this is the beginning of his book, Metaphors on Vision, which he publishes in 1963 and becomes the kind of manifesto for this entire generation of American avant-garde filmmakers. Imagine an eye unruled by man-made laws of perspective, an eye unprejudiced by compositional logic, an eye which does not respond to the name of everything, but which must know each object encountered in life through an adventure of perception. How many colors are there in a field of grass to the crawling baby unaware of green? How many rainbows can light create for the untutored eye? How aware of variations in heat waves can that eye be? Imagine a world alive with incomprehensible objects and shimmering with an endless variety of movement and innumerable gradations of color. Imagine a world before the beginning was the word. And that opening of his manifesto about vision, any filmmaker of this generation could have repeated, that this was the kind of something taken deeply to heart, that film could be used differently. And what Brakhage became famous for was sort of hand-painting the film, scratching the film, underexposing, using out-of-focus cinematography, all these sort of methods of defamiliarization, estrangement, and distortion that helped us to recapture, or so he thought, the fullness of perception that had been lost with the acquisition of language. The clip that I'm going to show you is from a film pretty early in Brakhage's career called Cat's Cradle, and he made it in 1959. And it's kind of from this transitional moment. In the 1950s, Brakhage was making black and white trance films that focused on an often adolescent male protagonist whose ego was sort of being shattered. And they were very influenced by film noir. They had this chiaroscuro lighting, this sort of heavy shadow, and they were very heavily laden with these existential, psychological anguish. That was the kind, that's not the films that he became famous for. And in the late 50s, he began to transition toward this other kind of filmmaking that involved opening himself up away from these kind of cliches of existential angst to the world around him. And he did that in part through these relationships that he had both with his wife, Jane Brakhage, who we see on the left with the braids, through Carolee Schneemann, artist friend, who we see in the middle, and that's Brakhage at the end. And these, there were two couples, Stan and Jane Brakhage, and Carolee Schneemann and James Tenney. James Tenney was an American composer and musician who had gone to high school with Brakhage and was his best friend. In the late 50s, these couples were sort of always seeing each other and really influencing each other. Brakhage was a filmmaker. Carolee Schneemann at that point was a painter. It was before she turned to performance and film. James Tenney was working on music, and Jane Brakhage was sort of raising the kids in Colorado and feeding the livestock. And Brakhage's films really changed, and he started making these films that were kind of documents of his life in Colorado. He made a film in 1959 that some of you may have heard of called Window Water Baby Moving, that's about the birth of his first child. And he started making films about sex in 1959. And he used Carolee Schneemann and James Tenney as surrogates for him and his wife. And he made these two films called Loving and Cat's Cradle, which had explicit, Loving has very explicit imagery of Carolee Schneemann and James Tenney, having sex outside in nature with all the sun shining and grass, and it's very idealized, sort of romantic portrait of heterosexuality. And Cat's Cradle, I think, is the more interesting film, and it's about the two couples interacting in Carolee Schneeman's home in Vermont. And so I wanted to, this film actually becomes extremely important for the evolution of Carolee Schneeman's own artistic practice. And so I wanted to show you an example of it, because it is and is not an example of the kind of untutored vision that Brakhage was after. In many ways, it's a kind, like Brakhage's films from this period, it's a study of light, texture, movement, pattern, all of these things he was fascinated with, but it's also a study of heterosexuality and of gender in the late 50s and the traditional roles kind of breaking down in tension. So I'm going to show you that. Okay, this is on YouTube. We'll watch about 4 minutes of it. I want you to try and pay attention to the repeated gestures and patterns that you're going to see. It's the two men and the two women, and how they're kind of subjected to these different forms of cliched gesture and performance. And the film is very saturated in red and magenta hues. That's Stan Brakhage. Carolee Schneeman, Jane Brakhage. That's James Tenney. That's a cat. So, one of the things that Brakhage is, So one of the things that Brakhage is doing is that he's making these sort of compulsive comparisons between the female's actions and the men's actions. And so I know it's hard to sort of take it in on a first viewing for those of you who haven't seen it before, but Stan Brakhage keeps coming through the door in this kind of parody of 1950s American TV sitcoms, like the Honey, I'm Home moment. He just like keeps coming in, and we see James Tenney sitting at the kitchen table, sort of brooding over something he's working on. And meanwhile, Brakhage is making these comparisons between the light streaming through the curtain, the light streaming through this cut glass vase, the wallpaper, the texture of the cat. Like he's trying to see these things differently through the use of the tone, through the rapid editing, through these sort of visual comparisons and distortions. And yet his portrait of the different genders is so 1950s and is so stereotypical that while the male artists are sort of brooding, you know, at work at the table, the women are rolling dough and cutting onions, and he keeps sort of cutting between them, rolling dough and cutting onions, that you would never would even know that some of the footage we see is of Carolee Schneemann painting. And so he's kind of essentializing women's activities as this kind of very cliched form of domestic labor. Carolee Schneemann felt completely deformed. Even though she had agreed to participate in these films, she felt completely deformed by their representation of her. That, you know, the film is called Cat's Cradle, but she felt that she had been entrapped in this sort of cat's cradle of stereotypical gender that in so many ways her life was trying to break out of. And part of her her dissatisfaction with the way that Brakhage had represented her in these films led her to cinema, to start to investigate, to make her own documents of intimacy and sexuality and heterosexuality. And so in many ways, Cat's Cradle had a very decisive influence on her because it moved her towards cinema. One of the things that she was outraged about in Cat's Cradle, I don't know if you noticed, but there's like insistent footage of her wearing an apron, this like cute kind of old-fashioned apron, and Brakhage's mother had sent it in the mail to him for Christmas, and Brakhage insisted that Carolee Schneemann wear it in every one of the shots, regardless of whether she was painting, in which she never wore an apron, or, you know, chopping onions. And she felt that she had been really deformed by this construction of her as this apron-wearing sort of cooking woman when she was working so hard against that. And, you know, in her relationship with James Tenney, they were equivalents, they were equals, they were both artists sort of pursuing their work, trying to expand their medium. And so because of her frustration with Brakhage's portrait, she went on to make her most famous film called Fuses, which she worked on between 1964 and 1967. And it's her own film about her having sex with James Tenney. And there's no outside camera person. It's sort of this very intimate look at lovemaking. And Brakhage and Carolee Schneemann really influenced each other profoundly. And so it looks in many ways like a Brakhage film, but that in part is because they influenced each other. Now Brakhage came to sort of paint on his films and scratch on their surface. In Fuses, Carolee Schneemann paints, collages, grows mold on, dyes, bakes in the oven, pours acid on, all of these sort of distortions that she does to the film. And you're going to see the intensely collage, multi-layered image that it gives us. And part of that is to show the kind of tactile sensations of sexuality, to try to imagine through this visual language what sexuality feels like. And so her camera kind of approaches a haptic visuality, a sense of vision that is based on touch. And so the thickness of the film and the density of the film kind of alludes to that. The camera, they tied the camera to the chandelier while they were having sex. They came up with all of these ways to use the camera as if it was a participant in their lovemaking rather than this neutral observer or this sort of surveillance equipment. And in all of these ways, she was trying to kind of undermine how she had felt surveyed and idealized and distorted by Brackage's camera and by a lot of the other male artist collaborators she had been working with in the 50s and 60s. And so I want to give you, show you an example of Hughes's. She was devastated when she brought the film to the lab after years of working on it and trying to raise the money for it and doing all this sort of handwork on the film, to find out that she had collaged it so thickly that it couldn't go through the projectors at the lab, and she had to remake it to make it thinner so it could actually be processed. But you're going to see some kind of remnants of that density. It had been playing a bit, so I just want to make sure that it was the part that I wanted to show you. I think it begins around 19 minutes. Actually. Okay. And so Carolee Schneemann was really sort of moving towards this kind of haptic visuality that I was talking about, in which kind of sensory perception was trying to embrace. Brackage was interested in vision, but Carolee Schneemann was really interested in tactility, and she became, most famous as, a filmmaker and a performance artist, but she was interested in using the kind of visual medium of cinema to communicate something of the tactility of sexuality. And when I show this movie to my classes in Montreal, one of my students was very disappointed because he felt like he couldn't really, like, one of Carolee Schneeman's famous lines about why she made fuses was she says, "I wanted to see the fuck," and Brakhage was so interested in all of these other things. He was so interested in, the vase and the bedspread, and he was so interested in these gender roles that she just wanted to see the kind of blinding core of sexuality. And when my students read that quote from her, one of my students was very disappointed because he felt like we weren't really seeing the fuck here, like we were seeing all this other stuff, like them in front of the window, her running on the beach, and that when the images of James Tenney and Carolee Schneeman were on screen, that they were sometimes very difficult to see through all of the collaged layers. And in my book, I think about, I use Merleau-Ponty's distinction between the visible and the invisible, where he's theorizing the invisible as something that is actually inside of the visible, as opposed to the just unseen. And so one of the things I write about in Schneeman's work is that she's seeing the kind of invisible core of sexuality, which involves precisely not seeing everything, that it's not being surveyed or sort of presented to us in these ideal conditions of Renaissance perspective, for example, that she's really interested in the bodily thickness of vision and how vision is a kind of part of embodied perception that she communicates through the film. The last, that's too lovely an image to end on, and so the last thing that I wanted to show you was from a different filmmaker, but very quickly I wanted to show you these images taken by your artist, Ara of Carolee Schneeman. In 1963, he documented one of her first important work of body art, which was called I Body, 36 Transformative Actions, and I could tell you more about that if you're interested later, but these are some of his documents of those early performances that she did in '63, even before she made fuses, and there's a whole series of them. I know you guys have a fantastic collection at this museum. It's images of fuses. So the last thing that I want to show you is from a filmmaker named Paul Sharits, who is often not associated with the other filmmakers that I write about in my book, because he's considered structural filmmaker, an avant-garde filmmaker, but structuralism kind of emerges in the late 60s, and in an American filmic vocabulary, that term is used to designate films whose structure is predetermined, and they often have these recognizable characteristics like a fixed camera or a fixed duration or rephotography off the screen. So in many ways you can think of Warhol's film Empire, which is 6 hours of the Empire State Building, as a structural film, because it's sort of like conceptual filmmaking. The concept is predetermined, the camera never moves, the film is over when the sun rises. So that's like the structure determines what's in the film, as opposed to fuses, which is a kind of more observational. Anyway, you get it. So Paul Sharits is always talked about as this kind of rigorous structural filmmaker who excludes bodily images. And so one of the reasons I wanted to include him in the book is because the films by Paul Sharits that are often written about are the ones that exclude the body, but so many of his films really depend upon the body, both in including images of the body, but just in the way they address the spectator. He's known as a pioneer of flicker films, in which different color flickers alternate to create this kind of throbbing visual impression. They work similar to the 19th century toy, the thaumatrope, in which, as you can see in this image, like there's an image, two different images on one side of a coin, and then they're flipped, and it creates the impression, like here, like the monkey is in the cage. And so they, flicker works on the same optical principle of the persistence of vision. So even though we're seeing just single frames of different color, we get this sort of image of this sort of throbbing, intensely vibrating screen. You could see how these effects are created when you look at Paul Sherratt's actual film strips, which he later decided to sort of put in sort of plexiglass cases and exhibit as artworks. But we see the kind of musical alternations of the different color that are going to create these extremely battering sensory effects on viewers, and that's a larger piece of the film frames where you could see just hundreds of different frames organized in these plexiglass boxes. So I want to show you an image that will be our last image, our last film, and it's from Paul Sherratt's 1968 film, Touching. And in this film, it begins with the letter T, and it sort of spells out touching in English as the film progresses, and we see, it's again a kind of portrait film. It's not of Paul Sherratt's, but of his best friend, the poet David Franks. And there is on the soundtrack one word that is repeated over and over again as we watch this kind of battery of effects that's happening through flicker. You'll see what I mean. I'm not getting sound though. Make it a little louder. That is, in many ways, the film that I feel baddest about showing you on DVD, because its full effects really depend upon the cinematic medium and the actual alternation of the, the colored frames through the projector and the use of the shutter in the projector. But I know that that would give you an idea. Ideally, the soundtrack should be much louder, and the single word that's being repeated over and over again is the word destroy. And the sort of silent pauses between the word have been edited out so that, as you know, it's more evident when you listen to it louder. But the word completely loses its semantic function. One of the things that, I mean, I've watched it a million times, but one of the things late in the game of writing the book, I wanted to like experience it differently with an untutored eye and an untutored ear as if I'd never seen it before. And so I sat there and I kind of wrote down everything that I heard on the soundtrack, and it was this like extraordinarily perverse list of things that I know, I'm sure that each of these things were very subjective, but when I saw it written down, how this word had kind of metamorphosized as I kept listening to it over and over again, it was a kind of record of my own subjective auditory experience of watching the film. The reason I wanted to end on that was, in the book I theorized not only sexuality, but the kind of range of corporeal effects that often include distress. Now, when that film is showed the way it's supposed to be shown, it's an extremely distressing physical experience. It just sort of visually and auditorially batters you as an audience member. And in this sort of turn towards the body that American filmmakers make in the 1960s, it's not only towards this sort of make love, not war kind of, you know, idealized notion we have of the 60s and the counterculture, but it's an exploration of the body in all of its difficulty and in sort of all aspects of what being in a embodied being involves. And so Paul Sherratt's very assaultive work that is depending upon our body to complete the circuit of the flicker is a kind of good example of the way that these filmmakers are not only interested in sexual pleasure and experience, but also in trauma and bodily duress and distress that actually brings us back to the Anne Buchanan. So I want to end really informally there. Thank you for being patient. If you have questions, maybe we could talk about it for anyone who wants to hang out, but thank you all for coming. Thank you.